after a somewhat chaotic start, here we are at last. Welcome. I'm John Pound, and on behalf of the Art Committee, I welcome you to our first art lecture, which we're now calling Gallery Talk, in the new Anderson Hall. We will have other gallery talks in the future, and we hope you will be with us for those as well. But for today, this is an introduction by way of saying it needs no introduction. Rebecca Albiani is a familiar and deservedly popular presenter here at Horizon House. We know her as a fabulous art historian who in the past has brought us many fine programs, rich with history and insights into the people who made great art in the past. And today she brings with her Peggy Guggenheim, who also needs no introduction, a forceful woman, a strong personality, a character who was at the center of the development of 20th century modern art. So now, here is Rebecca and Peggy to bring history to life. Thank you.
Splendid. You've all come. Benvenuti. Of course, I'm under no illusion that any of you is here to see me. Nor are you here for the quality of the bubbly, though it isn't the worst you'll get in Venice. That honor belongs to Harry's Bar. Honestly, the only reason to adulterate perfectly good Prosecco with peach juice is that it isn't perfectly good Prosecco. Poor Giovanni Bellini is rolling in his grave. No, you will greet me politely and you will drink my wine, but we all know that you are here to see my art. And what an irony it is that the black sheep of my illustrious family of peddlers and smelters, the least of the Guggenheims, should have amassed a collection of modern art that the whole world is clamoring to see. And I did it on very little money, too. I can see you rolling your eyes, thinking, how can a Guggenheim possibly claim to have had very little money? Well, since you're here to see my art, you're going to have to sit through some family history first. My dear father, Benjamin, wished to differentiate himself from his 6 brothers. So he left the family business and struck out on his own. This was not a sound pecuniary decision, but as bad as his financial planning was, his travel planning was worse. In 1912, he booked passage on a luxury ocean liner with all the bells and whistles. Yes, that way. He and his secretary ceded their berths in the first-class lifeboats to women and children who had none. They donned their tuxedos. They called for the finest cigars and the oldest cognac on board. And they met their deaths like gentlemen. I was 13. And it took a couple of years for my uncles to disentangle the mess my father had made with his finances. And when they did, I received an inheritance of $450,000, which might sound like a lot to you, but when your cousins have millions and millions, well, I had everything in trust. I had to count every penny, and I got a reputation as a dreadful cheapskate. Rich or poor, the lives of the Guggenheim women were dull. Cotillions and garden parties and the right cocktail fork. Here I am at the dog show with Benita and, oh yes, one of your predecessors, baby. And even Mother felt that that was rather improper. I treasure this photo of Benita because Lawrence tore up most of my pictures of her on the anniversary of her death. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Now, I was so bored that when the United States entered the Great War, I took a volunteer position doling out uniforms to service members, which was rather exciting. I met a whole new class of people. Then, once that was over, I got a job at a little bookstore just off of Grand Central Station. I wasn't paid anything there either, but it galled my mother that I was working at all. That little bookshop changed my life. It was a mecca for ideas, for people who felt that literature and art and culture were infinitely more important than trust funds or cocktail forks. I met the most astonishing people there. I met Hemingway, I met Marcel Duchamp, I met Alfred Stieglitz, and he took me to his gallery and showed me my very first abstract painting. It was by his lover, Georgia O'Keeffe, and I couldn't make heads nor tails of it at first. I had to keep turning it round and round before I figured which side was up. But I was right. However, the most important person for my life that I met at that bookstore is someone you will likely never have heard of. Lawrence Vale. He was called the King of Bohemia, and he was beautiful with that mane of golden hair. Whereas, not only did I not have much money, but I had absolutely no looks whatsoever. This nose has been the bane of my existence. I even tried to have a nose job in 1920, and in the middle of the operation, the surgeon threw up his hands and said there was nothing he could do. Left me with this tragedy. Well, after a couple of years at that bookstore, I persuaded Mama that we must return to Europe. Of course, I'd been as a child with governesses, but now I wanted to go because I was on fire for art, Renaissance art. I had read all 7 volumes of Bernard Berenson, and I wished to track down every Piero della Francesca in every dusty Tuscan village, which we did. Then, as one does, we ended up in Paris, and Lawrence was there. And I decided that my virginity had become a burden to me, and that Lawrence should be the one to relieve me of it. And I prepared. I had a book of erotic frescoes from Pompeii, and was determined we should try out all of the positions. Well, a couple of weeks later, Lawrence asked me to marry him. I don't know why he did it, really. The money, I suppose. But he was so flummoxed when I said yes that he fled to town to give me time to reconsider. I suppose that's what the young folks call a red flag. But he did come back and urged me to marry him the very next day. So I did. And then, after we were married, I felt very let down. I realized it wasn't a husband I needed. It was simply sex. But I was so sheltered, we didn't think of those things as separate realms. Well, I was enjoying being a bright young thing, dressing in wonderful fashions, and I had a certain superiority over Lawrence because of my money, and I abused it dreadfully, telling him it was my money and he couldn't have it. Well, he countered by increasing my sense of inferiority, telling me I was lucky to be accepted in Bohemia, and since all I had to offer was my cash, I should use it to support the interesting people I was being permitted to frequent. Eventually, of course, I found myself pregnant. And that was really the only thing Lawrence gave me, aside from the odd black eye. He threw me into a wall when I told him I was pregnant with Peggy. He hadn't wanted a second child. But I suppose I should consider myself lucky. My dear sister Benita didn't survive childbirth. And about the parental adventures of my other sister, Hazel, the less said, the better. Well, we moved to the English countryside, thinking it was better for the children. But what was not good was our constant rows. You know who finally gave me the courage to leave Lawrence? Emma Goldman. Now that was a woman. She finally got me to understand that I could have a husband or no husband, a lover or 3 lovers, but that I did not need to define my worth as a married woman of respectability. And that was a good thing, because I'd fallen in love with a married man. He was the love of my life, John Holmes, a writer, a brilliant man, but he had a bad war. It caused him writer's block. We lived in messy Bohemia out in the countryside in Hayford Hall, which we called Hangover Hall. All of the women were jealous of me and in love with John. Even Juna Barnes flirted with him shamelessly, and she is a lesbian. To this day, I write Juna Barnes a check every month for her support. And yet she, I'm certain, would tell you what a terrible cheapskate I am. We drank. We all drank. But John drank too much and it killed him. He was plastered when he broke his wrist. He was plastered when he went into the simple operation to set it properly. He never emerged from the anesthetic. We'd had 5 years together. 5 years in which he'd made it his goal to mold me into a person with ideas. He said I was like a kindergartner when we met, and he could make me someone interesting. I took up with another man but he became a communist, and that was rather a problem for me, as he forbid me to read Proust. He felt that all art should glorify the proletariat. So I broke with him, and was living in London on my own, really, for the first time. And a friend of mine told me that I needed to do something with my energies, to open a publishing house or start an art gallery or something. And I thought the publishing house idea sounded too expensive, which in retrospect is hilarious given the money that I've spent on art. So I decided that I would open a gallery, except that I really knew nothing about modern art. So I asked Marcel Duchamp to be my advisor, to teach me everything he could. I always had the best advisors, and I listened how I listened, and that is how I learned. Marcel was perfect. He taught me the difference between abstraction and surrealism. He taught me the threads that created contemporary art, and he introduced me to so many artists, and they all adored him. So we were very well received everywhere we went. He took me to Jean Arp's studio. We went to the continent, and Jean Arp took us to the foundry where they were casting this work, Head and Shell. And I asked if I could hold it. It's a very cunning little object. You see, it comes apart. And the moment I had it in my hands, I knew that I needed to own it. It was the first piece of modern art that I bought for myself. Well, we decided that our first show should be of Jean Cocteau, who was known in London only as a writer, but not as a visual artist. So we showed a variety of works on paper, designed for sets and costumes for the Luck of Lancelot, and the stories of the Round Table, a British topic that went over very well. And I wanted to show these magnificent drawings that Cocteau was doing in those years on his bed sheets. Portraits of his lovers as they were springing from the sheets. And the drawings were no problem at all, but the bed sheets got hung up in customs, not literally. No, the customs authority were certain that these works, some of which showed pubic hair, would be detrimental to British morality. And I finally had to agree not to hang them in any public space. I put them in the room I was using as an office, and that was acceptable. So this first exhibition garnered wonderful reviews and a lot of buzz for the gallery. We did an exhibition of Kandinsky next. He had never had a one-man show in England. And so we showed his work, and this too, we showed a whole range of it from a number of years. This too was very well received. In fact, I had a young teacher from the north of England write to me afterwards to say how overwhelmed he had been by the show and how inspiring it would be for him to such works. Kandinsky didn't mind so long as the paintings were insured, and so when the exhibit closed, this young man drove down from the north of England, piled 10 Kandinskys on top of his car, tied them down, and off he went. And 10 days later, he returned all the works undamaged, but told us how important, how life-affirming it had been for his students to get to see these important, vital works of modern art. But of course, this young man was in no position to buy anything, and no one else was buying either. But I knew that my Uncle Solly had wanted this painting some years earlier, so I wrote to him to see if he would like to purchase it. He had his horrid assistant, the so-called Countess Rebecca, reply to me, telling me that were they to stoop so low as to use a commercial gallery rather than dealing directly with the artist, my gallery would be the last one on earth that they would employ because of her, the Countess wrote. Guggenheim had come to stand for an ideal in art, and I was besmirching that name by dragging it through the mud of commerce. I framed that letter and hung it on my wall. However, no one bought anything. Well, our next show got us into trouble with the customs authorities yet again. Not for the reason you might be thinking, but rather because of an obscure law designed to protect the British gravestone industry. If stone were imported into England, the tariffs were very, very high. But if artworks were imported, the customs duties were quite reasonable. Well, the customs officials were not sure which these were, and we're talking works by Brancusi, by Jean Art, by Henri Laurent, by great European sculptors. So they brought in the head of the Tate Gallery to determine whether these were works of art. And he determined that they were not. Well, I had my assistant draft a letter, and we had it signed by all sorts of important critics, and we took our case to the House of Commons, and we won. So I considered myself to have done a service for continental sculptors as well as for the British art viewing public. I was becoming very interested in surrealism, which was so mysterious, even frightening. I bought this painting by Yves Tanguy despite, or perhaps because of, the fact that it sent shivers up my spine. But Tanguy wasn't frightening at all. He and his wife were lovely people, so unspoiled. In fact, Eve was so lovely that I made sure we ended up in bed together. Madame Tanguy did not take that very well, sadly. She threw a plate of fish in my face at a restaurant. But I hadn't intended to injure her. There was no malice in what I did. I simply wished to claim for for myself the same range of experience that men were allowed to have. Well, Tanguy's work continues to be an important part of the collection and an important influence. Now, we did a show, quite unheard of children's art, largely so that my daughter Peggy could show her work. She was about 11 at the time, and she made these girls in the arches, and she's always been a marvelous artist. The critics call her a sophisticated primitive, or a primitive sophisticate. I also showed a drawing, 3 naked men descending a staircase, if I recall, by the grandson of Sigmund Freud. Yes, I discovered Lucian Freud and gave him his first showing. But of course, no one bought his work either. It was just children's art after all. I continue to have works by Peggy in my collection, of course, from every stage of her career. This one was from when we were living in New York, with all of the excitement of our gallery there, of the openings of the artists. And Peggy is not only an artist herself, but has married an artist and been involved with more than one. And a more recent work is this one, with her 3 sons, rather rambunctious boys. Well, we did a show of Peter Mondrian, the opposite of surrealism, his serene, classical abstraction. And Mondrian, he was a very proper man with a rather military bearing, came to me to ask if I knew a good place in London to go dancing. Surprisingly, he was a marvelous dancer, which was fortunate because he could barely converse either in French or in English. But I was buying 1 piece at least from each show so that I didn't disappoint the artist, but I was terrible at selling art, and the gallery was hemorrhaging money. So I thought to myself, if I am so bad at this, why am I attempting to sell art at all? Why don't I found a museum? There was no museum of contemporary art in London in those years. And so I lured Herbert Reed away from the stuffy old Burlington magazine, and he became my advisor, and we scouted out locations, we drew up floor plans and lists of the essential artists of the 20th century who had to be included. But it was no good. It was 1939, and war was inevitable. So we stored what I had collected thus far, and shelved our plans, but I kept the list, and I went to Paris with the goal of buying a work of art every single day. And I came close. I bought works from the major artists like Picasso, but once word went out that I was buying, well, I had people coming to me in droves. It was such a desperate time. Everybody wanted liquid assets, and that meant getting rid of some of their canvas or stone ones. I went back to Jean Arp and bought this lovely overturned blue shoe with 2 heels under a black vault. Love this work. Is it a painting? Is it a sculpture? What is it? It's a belief. I bought works by Boccioni and Balla, the Italian futurists who were working in Paris in those days. Exciting works. And I bought this charming little Chagall from the very first year in which Chagall had come to Paris and was still apparently rather homesick for the shtetl. The wife of Salvador Dali, Gala, came to me one day and dragged me all over Paris trying to find this work to buy, all the time lecturing me on how I should not diffuse my energies by supporting all these different artists. I should do what she had done. I should put all of my energy and all of my resources into supporting Salvador Dali, who wasn't my favorite artist, but he was on the list, and so I bought him. And then sometime later, she came to me at some ungodly hour in the morning, must have been 10 o'clock, and I was still in bed, and she sold me this jewel, this little untitled dolly that I refer to as woman sleeping on the beach. So it seemed appropriate to buy this work from bed. The day Hitler marched into Norway, I marched into Fernand Léger's studio and bought this superb Men in the City for $1,000. But the work I wanted was out of my price range. It was Brancusi's Bird in Space. So elegant, so daring, so beautiful. He wanted $4,000 for it. So I wondered if perhaps he would give me a break on the price if Constantine and I were to become very intimate friends. And we did. It was marvelous. He was a wonderful man, half peasant, half satyr. And a couple of weeks later, I asked him, darling, could I buy the bird? And he said, of course, dear, for $4,000. I was furious and I broke it off with him, but I still coveted that damned bird, so I had my friend Nellie Duesberg patch things up between us, and I bought the bird for $4,000. I already had this charming little work, but it was that bird that I truly wanted. My advisor, Howard Putzel, took me to the studio of Max Ernst and told me that the Ernsts there were too cheap. Ernst was there with his mistress, Leonora Carrington. They looked rather like little Nell and her grandfather from Dickens' old curiosity shop. And since Howard said the Ernsts were not right, he encouraged me to purchase instead this painting by Leonora, The Horses of Lord Candlestick. She associated with her father. This was her first professional sale as an artist. I kept going back to Max's studio. He was magnetic, and I was drawn to him. And, of course, to his work, to his mystical, marvelous work, like The Kiss, or my favorite of his works, The Attirement of the Bride. With its Renaissance clarity of form, of perspective, and yet its surreal bizarreness, its costuming, its eroticism, it is all so very interesting. Yet these works were about his relationship with Leonora. And that went off the rails after Max was arrested a second time. First by the French for being German, and then by the Germans for being a degenerate artist. Leonora quite lost her head, sold their home for a bottle of brandy and fled. She ended up having shock treatments in an asylum in Madrid. Dreadful for her. But that left Max alone, which left an opportunity. Now, Max and I got involved with Varian Fry. Have any of you ever heard of Varian Fry? Hardly any. What a shame. That man was a hero. He was an American and came to France first at the behest of the State Department to get a sense of the situation in occupied France. And he quickly realized how perilous it was for intellectuals, Jews, writers, communists, artists, and so forth. So he set up this rescue committee and began to smuggle these people out of France, across the Pyrenees. And it was very expensive. They needed to pay bribes. They needed to pay forgers of documents and mountain guides and the like. And so he approached me to ask if I would underwrite Andre Breton's escape and that of his wife. Andre Breton was the father of surrealism, and his wife, Jacqueline Lambert, was also an artist of some distinction. And so, of course, I was honored to help them get to freedom. But they also wanted me to pay for their physician to leave France. And there I drew the line. Artists and geniuses are one thing, but doctors are a dime a dozen. So, we were in Marseille, and I was becoming much closer to Max, but I was beginning to realize that not only were artists at risk in occupied France, but so was my collection. After all, art was the Nazis' second favorite thing to burn. And so I knew that the Louvre was packing up the Mona Lisa and the Venus de Milo, and so I approached the curators there and asked if my works could find sanctuary with theirs. And the curators looked at my Kandinskis and my Picassos and my Brancusis and my Giacomettis and said none of it was worth saving. I did get the Fine Art Museum of Grenoble to store my collection in their basement for a time, but I knew it had to be temporary, and so I finally managed to get my collection camouflaged as household goods with the odd chair and table on top for the sake of illusion onto a ship that would take it to New York Harbor. But Max and I very nearly waited too long to save our own skins. We and Lawrence and his soon-to-be ex-wife, Kay, and our children and their children and Kay's children, all of us were on the very last Pan Am clipper out of Lisbon before things went completely to hell. Well, once we got to New York City, I threw myself into looking for a place to show my collection. And Max, of course, threw himself into work. After Pearl Harbor, I insisted that we wed. I was living in sin with an illegal, an enemy, alien at that point, and I thought it might regularize his situation, but I also hoped it might stabilize our relationship. I was gratified to see myself finally in one of his works, this little study for the anti-pope. He said that this figure on the left was Leonora, who had reappeared in New York City and was going horseback riding with Max, which caused me a great deal of pain. But here she is, apart. And Max is the white horse at the far right of the image. Next to Max am I, and behind me, the figure with the long blonde hair is Peggy. However, when Max reworked this study into the final painting, well, I didn't quite like what I saw. Leonora is still banished, but I seem to have split into two persons, one still with my face quite near Max's, but the other alone and separated, isolated, and the Peggy figure cuddling up to Max in a way that I did not like at all. It is so difficult to have a beautiful daughter. Well, Max and I were not making each other happy. He needed solitude to work, and I needed love to survive, and neither of us was getting what we needed. However, I located premises for my gallery. I decided I needed a space where I could showcase the great works of European modernism that I had acquired and show modern, exciting new work by the artists then in New York City. And my advisor, Howard Putzel, suggested that I speak with a European emigre. New York was teeming with them. Frederick Kiesler, who had done marvelous things at the Bauhaus, for some pointers on the design of the gallery. Those pointers cost me $7,000, but they were worth every penny. Art of this century was a masterpiece. We had a surrealist gallery, and from this angle you can see how the paintings are attached to the wall, but if you were standing right in front of one, it seemed to be floating. And you could reach out and adjust it. You could be interactive in a way that was unheard of before. Here I am in the surrealist gallery, and I still have this sort of silly, sort of fierce work by Leonore Feeney, but more to my taste is the Magritte above my head. I love how Magritte combines a visual language from the Italian Renaissance with absolute modernity. We had an abstract gallery which had walls of dark blue canvas undulating behind the works of Kandinsky and Picasso and Mondrian. And we had a kinetic gallery where you had to crank this work by Marcel Duchamp to get to the next image, where I displayed my Paul Clays on a conveyor belt. And originally we even had flashing lights, but it was hard to see the art with the flashing lights, so we had to abandon that idea. But it could not have been further from the blank white walls of the Museum of Modern Art, or my Uncle Solomon's oh so stuffy Museum of Non-Objective Art, where they piped in Bach, and everything was oh so elevated in tone. Art of this century was not elevated. We got our hands on the art, and it was electrifying and fun. For the opening, to show my absolute impartiality between surrealism and abstraction, I wore one earring by Sandy Calder and one by Yves Tanguy. And this was our first show. We showed objects by Joseph Cornell, the box valise of Marcel Duchamp, and bottles by, yes, Lawrence Vale. I was still supporting my ex-husband. Lawrence remarked, or rather, he wrote a statement for this exhibition in which he said that he used to throw bottles and now he painted them, which was rather insightful for Lawrence. It was also a fundraiser for the Red Cross. We did a great deal of benefit work for the war effort. Joe Cornell was such an odd duck of a man. Lived with his mother in this teeny tiny house in which he produced these magical objects. He was fascinated by Hollywood, and so he called this one Fortune-Telling Parrot for Carmen Miranda. And as we lose ourselves in the confines of this box, it seems to transport us somewhere exotic, someplace where women wear bananas on their heads and dance around. But my favorite of his works that I purchased was this one. Setting for a fairy tale. He uses a Renaissance print as the main image, but then he places those twigs behind it and paints them silver, which gives them a vaguely menacing feel to behold, as if this is Sleeping Beauty's castle about to be overrun by brambles. There is something so nostalgic, so fairy tale about this work. Marvelous. We did a show of women artists, entirely women artists, perhaps the first ever done on such a theme. 31 women. I like to joke that I ought to have capped it at 30. Unwisely, perhaps, I let Max evaluate the work of various women artists, visit their studios to see what they were doing. And when Max got to Dorothea Tanning's studio, this work was on the easel. Max christened it Birthday, perhaps because he was trying to seduce her into her birthday suit. And essentially he never left. This was the final nail in the coffin of our marriage, and we divorced in 1943, and he would go on to marry Dorothea. Now, it's quite obvious that Dorothea's work owes a tremendous amount to surrealism. But that thread is present in abstract expressionism as well, and it's not usually well understood. You have to remember how many surrealists there were in New York in the 40s. There were Max, André Breton, Yves, and Mata, and Victor Brauner, a dear friend of mine whom we also got across the Pyrenees. And these men were talking to the younger generation of artists, encouraging them to undergo Jungian analysis, to examine the morass of their psyches and see what was worth dredging up onto their canvases. So if you look at a work like Clifford Still's Jamais, Never, it looks completely abstract, perhaps. But if you look carefully, you can see that that black form is actually a figure. That this is a tiny head up at the top. It's something that Still got from Miro and Picasso and these other artists who were using a sort of biomorphic visual language for their versions of surrealism. I gave Cliff Still his first one-man show. Then I did a show of collage. I wanted to combine works by the originators of this very fertile vein of 20th century modernism. People like Picasso and Picabia and Kurt Schwitters with his magnificent Nats builds made up of bits of detritus that he's found on the street and yet has transformed into these marvelous compositions. But with these works, I invited some of the younger New York artists to show, Jackson Pollock and Robert Motherwell. And while Pollock was not entranced by the medium, Motherwell was, and he has continued to produce collage to make it an important part of his output. I gave Bob Motherwell his first one-man show not long afterwards, and he is still raving about how splendid the design, the production were, the way that we hung his canvases and his drawings. And Motherwell was always at the gallery giving impromptu lectures on Kandinsky or Picasso for the younger artists. I gave Mark Rothko his first one-man show. I wasn't quite sure about Rothko, but I was convinced that he was important, and so I listened. But my most important contribution to the history of art was, of course, my discovery of Jackson Pollock, which again I cannot take full credit for. We were staging a group exhibition and jurying the show. Myself and Max and Marcel and Pete Mondrian, and there was this work by this Jackson Pollock. And I walked up to it and I said, dreadful, isn't it? 20 minutes later, I realized Pete Mondrian was still standing in front of the Pollock. So I stood beside him and looked and said, he has absolutely no discipline. And Mondrian of the black and white grid and the primary colors, Mondrian, the most disciplined artist of the 20th century, said to me, yes, no discipline. That no discipline makes this most exciting painting I've seen in ages. So, it was included in the show, and I did something quite rare at the time. I offered Jackson a salary. I asked him if he wished to continue working as a carpenter for Uncle Solly's museum, or whether he would rather have $150 a month to paint. And anything that I sold above that amount would be his to keep. And if I did not sell anything, well, I kept the Pollocks, which meant I ended up with a lot of Pollocks. But he accepted. And so I gave him a commission to paint a mural in my own apartment, his largest work, which had the beginnings of this explosive rhythm moving across the canvas. It was, at the time, his largest painting, and in fact was a little too large, for when he came to install it, we found it was 6 inches wider than the space allotted for it. And Jackson was getting upset. He was drunk, of course, but he was a sloppy drunk, and sometimes a violent drunk, and he was about to shade over that line when Marcel Duchamp arrived with a pair of scissors and trimmed the canvas to just the right size. Crisis averted. Well, Pollock continued to paint in his undisciplined fashion, and then his wife, Lee Krasner, came to me and said, Manhattan is too much for Jackson. If I can get him out in the countryside, if I can get him off the bottle, I know he can do something great. I feel it. All we need is a loan for $2,000 to buy a home in Springs on Long Island. I said, Lee, do I look like a bank? But Lee outplayed me. She took her offer to another dealer, and I had to not only fork over that $2,000 loan, but double their monthly allowance. However, to my astonishment, Lee was right. When he got to Springs, when he began to work in a barn for a studio, it freed Jackson to begin his experiment with the drip. Now, unlike Mondrian, Jackson Pollock was a dreadful dancer, unless he was painting. Then he had this unbelievable grace as he was spooling paint onto his canvas. He worked on the ground and dripped and swung and swayed. It was magnificent. And these works would put New York City on the map as the center of the art world. I always felt that Lee and Jackson were a little unfair to me. If it were not for my support, Jackson might have crashed into a tree years before without creating the breakthrough works that he did. But Lee always saw me as an adversary more than a support. Well, once the war was over, I decided I was tired of my bed. So I had Sandy Calder making me a new one, the one you can see right in here inside my bedroom. It's silver, and the fish and the dragonflies, these little parts, they are suspended from the frame so that when the bed shakes or sways, so do the dragonflies and the fish. It's rather delightful. But as I used the bed, I came to realize that it wasn't my bed that I hated. It was the United States. And when my dear friend Mary McCarthy invited me to accompany her on a trip to Venice, I knew I had found my home. And one of my accountants performed a miracle. He managed to break my trust, which heretofore had just given me trickles of money. And now he could make it available for a major purchase, that of the palazzo that we are all standing in, the unfinished palazzo on the Grand Canal. And because it never rose above one story, it was not subject to the same laws of historic preservation as the rest of Venice, so I could gut it for the display of my artwork. I had Marino Marini make me this angel of the city with his exuberant salute across the Grand Canal to the Questura, the police department on the other side. Now, originally, Marino designed it with a detachable phallus, so that I could remove it when the nuns from over there were traipsing by, so as not to scandalize them overly. But after one of my dinner parties, I found it missing. Some guest had pocketed it as a souvenir. So now it is welded on. Don't get any ideas. You might remember that when I first came to Venice, that I was invited to show my collection in the Biennale of 1948. They gave me the Greek pavilion. I felt like a sovereign nation. But I could not yet have my collection in my home because the customs duties were just astronomical. So I sent it around, sent the exhibition to Rome and to Milan and eventually to Zurich. And it turns out that the tariffs for art entering for Switzerland are much more reasonable. So finally I was allowed to bring my beloved artwork home. When I first moved to Venice, the artistic environment here was moribund. There was no audience for contemporary art, for abstract painting, and those few artists who were working as abstractionists felt as if they were screaming into the void. Well, not only did I begin to support artists like Emilio Vedova and Giuseppe Santomaso, but they also got to see my collection. Now, in New York City, the mingling of my works of great European modernism and the artists themselves who had fled fascism and the new artists who were fascinated by that style, well, it was ebullient. It created the crucible out of which abstract expressionism was formed. When I brought not just those Picassos and Kandinskis and Mirots and Chagalls to Venice, but also my Pollocks and my Motherwells and my Rothkos, again, my collection performed that same alchemy, and a new generation of Venetian artists was inspired to make groundbreaking works. I'm particularly close to Tancredi. He's practically my son-in-law. He and Peggy live in the basement, but you can see the energy that comes out of this knowledge of European and American modernism coming back to Europe. Of course, I'm still buying internationally as well. I believe surrealism continues to be a vital force, and so recently I purchased this Magritte, Empire of Light, which some people walk right past without realizing what is surreal about this painting at all. They aren't noticing that the house is sunk in twilight gloom, while the sky is pure daylight. It's classic Magritte. And I recently bought this Monkey by Francis Bacon, a work that has all of that energy of abstract expressionism, and yet which places it into a figure of sorts, so turns its back on pure abstraction. And I think that Bacon is trying to say that man continues to be ruled by those animal urges, by the lower parts of our personalities. But abstraction and surrealism, they will persist, they will continue to inspire artists going forward. And they should inspire you as well. I am planning on expanding the opening hours of my museum home. I encourage you to come back during those open hours. Unless you are a reasonably attractive man who would like to see the dragonfly sway, then you're welcome to call it any hour. But the rest of you, I hope, will return during open hours, because I want my collection to be a resource, to be a fresh jewel in the glittering crown of this city I adore. Thank you. Does anyone have a question? Well, then you'll have to come back with your questions. Thank you
Peggy?
so much for coming.
Peggy,
Yes,
if I could ask one over here, down here. Just one question. It seemed to me that you had a more intuitive feel for sculpture. Would you agree with that?
I've never really thought about it. I think, though, that that is correct, because there's something very tactile about sculpture that does appeal to me on a different level from something like, a Magritte. There is an intellectual rigor that I enjoy in paintings. And yes, it's there in the sculptures as well, but before I even get there, there is that sensual quality. So yes, I think that is quite well said. Thank you. Well, thank you all so much for coming.